About 15 years ago, the author by the name of Suzanne Collins wrote one of the best-selling series that became known as The Hunger Games. I don't share this because I think a bunch of you read or even cared about the series, but the ending particularly of the series struck me. The novels are a dystopian series under totalitarian rule, and every year the people in the novel were divided into tribes, and they would compete in these Hunger Games, and whichever teenager won the Hunger Games that year won food for their tribe for the next year. But at the end of this series, an underground movement that has developed throughout the series overthrows the regime. The hero of this story is given the opportunity to put a final arrow in the leader of that oppressive regime. And there's a line that says, "May her arrow signify the end of tyranny and the beginning of a new era." And she stands there at the end of the book with her arrow sighted on the former president, but in a twist of events, she raises the arrow and actually shoots it at the leader of the new movement. With that, Suzanne Collins made her statement. This is at least how I understand it. Her statement: all authority is corrupt. No matter who is in power, civilization is just a cycle of one corrupt regime to the next. So the protagonist, instead of executing the former leader, raises the arrow to take out the new one, because all societies, all authorities are the same. Those in power are corrupt. Authority among humanity is always corrupted, and personal sovereignty is the way. And I wonder if such a pessimism towards authority has made its way into our understanding of Christianity. Is the authority of Christ over our life of any consequence and of comfort to us? And I ask that deliberately. You understand that authority in God's world is intended to be a source of comfort. Do you invite Jesus' arrival as a disruption to your sinful ways? Or do you keep him at a distance, one you will sing about, but not one you'd embrace to refine your behaviors today? How do we respond to Christ's authority? You can see in Mark 11, verse 28, that the word authority is of great concern in this passage. Specifically, they come to him and they say, it's not in 28, yeah, it is 28. They said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" And so authority is the question of the passage here. And Mark is not wanting you to ask, where does Christ get this authority? But he's showing you that it is a clash of authority. And what Mark is doing is he's bringing his narrative to a close. Jesus began his ministry in Mark chapter 2. And if you'll remember structurally, after Jesus' ministry began, there were 3 conflict passages that Jesus had with representatives from Jerusalem. That is, the Jerusalem Supreme Court essentially sent people who had conflicts with Jesus. And if you'll remember in Mark 3, verse 6, the end of those 3 conflicts ended with this line: "The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." And if you'll look up at Mark 11, verse 18, you will see we're revisiting those conflicts. Mark 11, verse 18, "The chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him." It's at the end of our passage, Mark 12, verse 12, "And they," that's the chief priests and the scribes, "were seeking to arrest him." And so at this point in the narrative, Jesus has now come to Jerusalem himself, and Mark is giving us 3 more conflict passages through Mark chapter 12. Where we are today is at the introduction of those conflicts. That is, our passage today is a discussion about Jesus' authority and a parable of the tenants. And Mark already assumes that you know the answer to the question, where has Jesus' authority come from? If you'll remember, throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has already demonstrated his power over nature, his power over demons, his power even over death, And Mark has made the argument to us that Jesus is God in flesh. He has now entered into Jerusalem and is now standing in the midst of his people. So the point here is not for you to ask, where did Jesus' authority come from? Mark wants to explain to you why Israel's authorities are rejecting Jesus' authority. Why is Israel's leader in conflict with their divine king? To give an example of what Mark is doing all week long, there have been sports channels that are filled with plays from the Super Bowl from last Sunday. The point of those replays has not been to announce the results that are already known, but instead to explain to you the key moments, the decisive moments that led to the Chiefs' victory. In the same way, Mark is detailing for us how God's good authority triumphs over the wicked authorities that were leading the temple in Israel. And so what that Mark is doing is he's not presenting an anti-authority gospel. The gospel is not anti-authority. What Mark is doing is he's presenting a gospel where bad authority is overthrown by good authority. Christianity is about the good authority of God invading our reality and lives. And the Scripture's divided responses to Christ's authority shows up in two categories of people. There are those in Scripture who stumble over Christ, and there are those who stand on Christ. That's the theme that Isaiah set up in chapter 28. It's what Psalm 118 is talking about. The stone that the builders rejected became the cornerstone. 1 Peter is going to quote this again in chapter 2, and it divides the world into two kinds of people. There are those who are wise, who become fools because they stumble over the cornerstone. They appear wise, but they stumble over Christ. And then there are the fools of the world who receive Christ as the wisdom of God, and there they stand on the cornerstone. So I ask again, when it comes to Christ, what happens in your heart when he lays claim to your ways and your life? When Jesus calls you to take up your cross and follow him, do you receive his commands as wisdom? Is Christ's commands to you a comfort? Are those what you would call goodness? Do you rejoice in the goodness of God's authority over you in Christ? Or has our American Christianity turned more into Western individualism rather than gospel king and kingdom? I'm going to divide the passage in three ways. First, let's look at Christ who exposes bad authority. Chapter 11, verses 27 to 33. The first thing we see here, Christ exposes bad authority. Mark 11, 27 to 33, if you'll look at this with me. It writes, "And they came again to Jerusalem. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. And they said to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?' Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me.' And they discussed it with one another, saying, 'If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say from man?' They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, 'We do not know.' And Jesus said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.'" If you'll notice, the answer to verse 28 has already been proven in Mark's gospel, hasn't it? Remember in Mark 3, verse 14, Jesus sends out his apostles, and what does he give them? Authority to cast out demons. And immediately following the commission of the apostles, Jesus is accused of casting out demons by whose power? Satan's, right? He's accused of casting out power by the power of Satan. It is by Satan's authority that Jesus does such things. Of course, Jesus demonstrates how silly that is. In Mark 6, verse 2, Nazareth responds to Jesus' teaching and his miracles, and they say, "Where did this man get these things? What's this wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands?" And so what Mark is doing here is he's not getting you to answer this question. He's already answered it for you. He's from God. What Mark is showing you here is that the arrival of the authoritative messianic Son of God does not allow neutrality from wicked rulers. The arrival of Jesus has caused either those who stand with him or those who stumble over him. So Jesus, as God's Messiah, has now invaded the temple. That's what we saw last week. He's now standing in Jerusalem, and Israel's leaders must come out. So all they can think to do is say, well, by what authority are you doing this? Verse 30, Jesus refuses to play their game, and he submits his own question. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? This is an impossible question for them. They cannot answer it publicly. For verse 31, if they admit that it's from heaven, well, what did John testify to? Jesus was the Christ. So if they say that John was from heaven, then they are acknowledging that Jesus is the Messiah. But verse 32, and this is really, it's hard to demonstrate it here, but in verse 32, what's really going on is they're saying there's no way we can say it's from man. They're terrified. They're deliberating. We can't say it's from man because what will happen? Well, they're scared of the people. They're afraid of the masses who really held John to be a prophet. Remember, everyone was coming out to John. So they can't say he's from heaven because then they're affirming Jesus' identity, but they're too cowardly to say that it's from man because the people will revolt against them. So verse 33, they pick the coward's way out and they say to Jesus, well, we don't know. And they refuse to answer. And the point is that Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem has scattered the roaches. His identity and his authority is provocative by nature. So as the temple leaders seek to expose him as a heretic, what really happens is Jesus' questioning has exposed them. I mean, is there nothing in them going, well, what's true? Instead, they're simply saying, how do we get around this? How do we save our souls? How do we save our position as temple leaders? And what you see is that the rulers of the temple are not governed by a conviction for what God has said or what is from God, or else they would have listened to John. Instead, they're governed by whatever keeps them in power. They're not interested in making decisions that commend God's Messiah to his people. They're only interested in saving face, keeping their rule. And so what's happening here is that the arrival of one who is truly good forces the wicked to act. Jesus' conviction, Jesus' commitment, Jesus' righteousness clashes with their wickedness. There's no neutrality. Lauren and I, as I've mentioned a few times now, when we moved, it turns out the lot that we moved onto was vacant for almost a decade. And because of that, the neighboring dogs had made our yard their stomping grounds. Well, we have a dog, and it's a shepherd, and shepherds don't like people who aren't a part of the pack. So now that these dogs have been coming over, now that our dog is there, there's conflict, and so they don't come over anymore. He is not a neutral party. He doesn't welcome you wild dogs. By nature, that's what he does. He's a shepherd. He has his flock. He's going to protect them. With the arrival of Jesus comes the scattering of those who had usurped God's people. Because Jesus is a faithful shepherd. Those who reject God and use God's people for their own agendas cannot remain in Christ's presence without a reaction. The temple leaders and Jesus are like oil and water. And so Jesus, as a good and righteous king, provokes wicked authority. Not because he represents non-authority, but because he himself is an authority about something totally different. Jesus' rule repels compromised hearts and duplicitous agendas. And we at our men's breakfast yesterday reflected some on this. If you want to think about the rulership of Jesus further, I'd encourage you to meditate on Psalm 101. Psalm 101 is it's a psalm that rejoices in the virtues of the king. I'll read part of it to you. And just listen to how sweet good authority is. Wouldn't it be good if everyone in power in the land ruled this way? Listen to what it says. The king says, "Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy." Could you imagine how less news we would have if our authorities destroyed those who slandered? "Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure. No one who practices deceit shall dwell in my house. No one who utters lies shall continue before my eyes. Morning by morning I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord." What a beautiful thing it would be if we could put someone in power who was perfectly just and could guarantee the elimination of all the wicked in the land. Wouldn't every human want that? Isn't that an agreeable, commendable goal? And what Mark is showing you here is that Jesus is that sort of king. And his arrival forces the hand of the wicked. There's no neutrality. He exposes their hypocrisy. And because Mark assumes you already know by what authority, he's inviting you and I to ask now, do you want this king in power? Not because you have a choice. He's saying, which authority are you going to side with? And shouldn't we count it a privilege to have someone like Christ in authority who would get rid of the wicked authorities? But why don't Israel's leaders want him? That's the point of the next parable. Let's read it. Mark 12, 1-8. "And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it. He dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And so with many others. Some they beat, and some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But those tenants said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours.' And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard." So Jesus tells a parable. It's a parable of the tenants, which is about a vineyard. And as Pastor Nate said earlier, this comes straight out of Isaiah 5. Jesus is not speaking neutrally. He's confronting Israel's leaders. He's referring to the people of Israel. And God in this parable is the man who planted the vineyard. The fence, the pit, the tower, these are references to God's historic provision to his people Israel, from the Exodus to the Promised Land, to the temple, to the law, all that God had provided for his people, Israel, who were his inheritance. The tenants in the parable are the priests and the elders and the kings of Israel throughout the year who had rejected God's prophetic warnings. These leaders ruled the vineyard for themselves. The fruit that they bore when the prophets were sent was not love and compassion for their neighbor. They did not care what God's law had commanded. They had no interest in one another. They were partial. They were partial to the rich. They had oppressed the widow and the poor. They had neglected to love one another. They had used the law as a way of abusing one another. And so the Lord, in his mercy, would send servants or prophets, verse 2, to warn Israel, to turn them from their wayward ways. But verse 3, Israel regularly rejected those prophets and their messages. Remember the book of Amos in chapter 7, verse 12, as he's preaching, Israel's response to Amos is, "Go away, Seir. Flee to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there and do your prophesying there. Never come prophecy at Bethel again." This was time and time again Israel's response to different prophets. Verses 4 and 5 show that it happened repeatedly. Some they sent away, some they mocked, they shamed, some they even killed. And it's essentially a summary of the time of Israel from their birth to the end of the Old Testament. So verse 6 reveals in the parable that the vineyard owner has one more step to take in his plan. He is going to send his son. And of course, that's pointing to what God is doing in Jesus. Jesus is the consummation of God's plan. His arrival is the last thing God is going to do. But you'll notice in verse 7 that the identity of the person being sent is not lost on the tenants. They recognize the Son. And what does their recognition of the Son do? Well, they should have honored the Son. They should have revered the Son. But because they knew who it was, what did they do? It provoked their aggression. They sought now to further kill them, and they reasoned so that they could take and usurp his inheritance. And in verse 8, that's exactly what they do. So here's the point. It is tempting to explain Israel's leader rejecting Jesus merely out of ignorance. They just didn't recognize him. They were neutral, they had decent hearts, and they just chose to reject him because they couldn't tell who he was. But the point of the parable is that Israel's leaders know exactly who's standing before them. Don't draw the conclusion that these are innocent people choosing to kill Jesus because they think he's a heretic. They're killing him because they know exactly who he is. Verse 7. This is the heir, come let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Jesus was not killed because he was unknown. Jesus was killed because Israel's leaders knew who he was. He is the rightful owner of the leaders, and the leaders, instead of submitting to him, wanted what was his, so they killed him. Israel was Christ's inheritance. The temple leaders had taken what was his and tried to use it for themselves. And so at the root of the rejection of Christ is because we know his identity and his authority. It is our greed that does not want to give to him what is his. You just think about it for a moment. What is murder? Murder is the presumption to destroy another human being made in Christ's image. It's the recognition of somebody made in the image of God and the willful choice to take ownership over them such that you think you can eliminate them, even though you have no right to do so. They are not yours. What is rebellion to parents? Isn't it the arrogance to do away with the structure Christ gave to human authority? To give to human flourishing, Children, your parents are a gift from the Lord, and yes, they're not perfect, but they are wisdom from God to you. And your general disposition should be one of receiving them as a gift. Why is it a sin to neglect a gathering with the church? Well, because it's arrogant to say that you can be a part of Christ's body and do what you want with it. Who cares what Jesus intends for his people? And you detach yourself from it. What is envy and theft? Well, it's hatred at how Christ has planned out the distribution of goods within human history. What is church abuse? It's the usurping of evil leaders to take Christ's people and fleece them for themselves. I wish to persuade you that the problem in these areas is not authority, it's misused, abused, wicked authority. It's bad authority. It's bad authority that hates the rule of Christ. The problem isn't authority, it is authority that refuses to trust the Lord. It's authority that refuses to submit to Jesus, to recognize who he is. And this means that none of us respond neutrally to Christ's rule. You either stumble over it or you stand upon it. And you'll notice, verse 9, what does the vineyard owner do? He comes to destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Mark is explaining Jesus has just judged the temple, and he has appointed 12 apostles throughout his gospel. Those are the others that are now going to lead the vineyard. The temple leaders will kill Jesus because they know him and they hate him, and therefore his commands make them stumble and rile. What happens in your heart when Christ is preached and applied? What happens when somebody brings his commands to bear down on you? Do you hate it? Or are you thankful for Christ's wise rule? Do you invite the Lord to refine you? Do you invite him to trim you of your dross and dead limbs? Or do you hate moral reformation? The temple leaders will kill Jesus because they know and hate him. But let's look at verses 9 to 12. What will the owner of the vineyard do? Well, he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them, so they left him and went away. Having just pronounced the parable that the temple leaders will kill Jesus, don't you find verse 11 strange? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. What's going on here? Last week, when Jesus marched in for the triumphal entry, the crowds were singing a psalm, and that was Psalm 118, the rejoicing of the Davidic ruler who would conquer the nations and then enter into the temple. Well, this is the same psalm that Jesus is quoting here. He's quoting Psalm 118 once again. He's quoting it specifically in verse 10. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Verse 9 is speaking of the tenants, and those are the builders in verse 10. The tenants over Israel are the builders, and they are stumbling over this Davidic ruler. And the point is, the Old Testament long prophesied, especially demonstrated in this psalm, that the tenants or the experts in Israel, when the king arrives, they would overlook him. There's a tradition saying that God is going, when he sends his king, the experts over Israel will be blinded. They will stumble over him. That's why they will reject him. The idea is that you are building a structure, you've got a key part there, and you just throw it out. You think it's useless. It's foolish to you. We don't need this, so you throw it away. And examining the bricks, the experts are throwing Christ out. They know better. They don't need him. Verse 10 and 11 tell us that it's that very stone that God is going to use as the foundation of his people forever. It's the foundation. Israel's leaders threw out the foundation for the people of God for all eternity. That is, Israel's leaders, in all their human wisdom, cannot come to the conclusion that salvation is bound up in Jesus. They can see him for who he is, and they say, we don't want it. We don't need it. And they throw him out on a cross. But in their doing so, they do exactly what the Lord intends. They make him the cornerstone of God's very promises. You see the point? God is so marvelous that even the wickedness of these evil authorities could only contribute to bringing about the reality, the realization of God's good promises. So what Mark is saying to you as we enter into the months leading up to Easter, don't fear these conflicts and don't fear the crucifixion, because God is going to do a wonderful thing through the folly of these Israelite leaders. And so the conclusion of verse 11 is that God's salvation provided through a crucified king is what? Verse 11. It's marvelous. It's marvelous. This is the Lord's doing. And what Mark is showing you here is that not only is Jesus' authority good and the bad authority hates Jesus, but Jesus' good authority consumes the authority of the wicked. Bad authority hates Jesus' good authority. When it sees him, it throws it out, stumbles upon him, and in their stumbling, Jesus' good authority overcomes the wicked men and provides a place for sinners to stand. Have you heard the story of the sheepdog, the Georgia sheepdog, the livestock guardian dog recently? There were apparently a pack of coyotes, 11 to 12 coyotes, that had their sights set on a flock of sheep. And they came to attack, and the livestock guardian dog stood in the middle. And he ended up killing 8 of the coyotes. One livestock guardian dog slaughtered 8 coyotes, and the remaining fled, and the dogs survived. If you could ask the sheep, what do they think about that? What do you think that they would say? I think they would say, I'm glad we hid in the wounding of the dog. I'm glad the dog was wounded that we might live. It was his wounding that brought their life and the death of the coyotes. And so I ask you this. When Christ calls you to follow him by taking up your cross, what do you think of that command? Do you hear in that command the love of your shepherd? Do you hear in that command a good authority who says to you, I have been wounded on your behalf. I'm not going to give you commands that harm you. I'm going to show you the path of life. In my wounding, you will live if you stand where I was crucified. And so he invites his disciples to take up their cross and follow him. Do you receive Christ's authoritative commands as his protections? Christ's commands are his protections. See, Mark does not want us to come to this story and flee authority. He wants you to recognize what we need is the crushing of wicked authority replaced by one who is good and right and rules perfectly. You do not need to flee authority. You need to submit to good authority. So I ask again, what happens to you when Jesus says, if you want to save your life, you must lose it? If you want to follow me, take up your cross. Do you marvel that it's by a cross Jesus has overthrown all the abuse that was embodied in the wickedness of Israel's leaders, of which we participated? Our own sin has usurped God's reign over our lives, and Christ is the means by which God has won it back. Is the cross folly to you? Is the cross a stumbling block to you? Or in it do you see the wisdom of God? Remember the words of 1 Peter chapter 2? There are two types of people in this world. Those who stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But what about those who embrace the cross? Peter says, you who believe are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you've received mercy. See, the church is not anyone in this room gathered to Jesus. It is those who embrace Christ and embrace his cross as the wisdom of God. The church that has overcome the evil one is the one who trusts their king not only for salvation, but the method by which he commands salvation. They are those who trust their king. So when they hear of the cross, they hear that it is the wisdom of God.